Middleware is a function that is called before the route handler and any other building blocks are processed. This includes interceptors, guards, and pipes. Middleware functions have access to the request and response objects and are not specifically tied to any method, but rather to a specified route path. Middleware functions can perform the following tasks: executing code, making changes to the request and response objects, ending the request-response cycle, or even calling the next middleware function in the call stack. When working with middleware, if the current middleware function does not end the request-response cycle, it must call the next method, which passes control to the next middleware function. Otherwise, the request will be left hanging and never complete. So how can we get started creating our own middleware? Custom Nest middleware can be implemented in either a function or a class. Function middleware is stateless. It cannot inject dependencies and doesn't have access to the Nest container. On the other hand, class middleware can rely on external dependencies and inject providers registered in the same module scope. In this video, we'll focus on building a class middleware, but remember, you can always use functions to create them as well. Let's fire up the terminal and generate a middleware class using the CLI, and let's call it logging. Note that we generated this middleware in the common directory again, since it isn't tied to any specific domain. Let's open up this newly generated logging middleware file and see what we have inside. As we can see, the Nest CLI generated an example middleware without any logic inside. Similar to providers, a middleware is a class with the injectable decorator. All middleware should implement the Nest middleware interface exported from nest.js/common. This interface requires us to provide the use method within our class. This method does not have any special requirements. Just remember to always call the next function, otherwise the request will be left hanging. For now, we'll keep things simple. Let's just add a console log before invoking the next function to see how middleware fits into the request-response lifecycle. With this in place, we can now register our newly created middleware. As we've mentioned earlier, middleware aren't specifically tied to any method. We can't bind them in a declarative way using decorators. Instead, we bind middleware to a route path represented as a string. To register our logging middleware, let's open up our common module file. First, let's make sure that our common module class implements the Nest module interface. This interface requires us to provide the configure method, which takes the middleware consumer as an argument. The middleware consumer provides a set of useful methods to tie middleware to specific routes. Just to test it out, let's apply the logging middleware to all routes using the asterisk or wildcard operator. To add our middleware, let's call the apply method on consumer, passing in our logging middleware, and then let's call the forRoutes method, passing in the wildcard asterisk. Let's save our changes and navigate to Insomnia and perform an HTTP request to any endpoint. Let's go back to VS Code and see if anything popped up in our terminal. Great, we can see hi from middleware string in our console. Now, taking a step back to our middleware consumer, there are several other ways of tying middleware to different route paths. So far, we've bound the logging middleware to every route using the asterisk wildcard, but we could also apply it only to routes with, let's say, the coffees prefix if we want. We can even restrict middleware further if we'd like, let's say to a particular request method, like only forget methods, by passing an object containing the route path and request method like so. Note that we imported the request method enum we used in previous lessons to reference the desired request method type. Lastly, we can also exclude certain routes from having the middleware applied with the exclude method. This method can take a single string, multiple strings, or a route info object identifying routes to be excluded. For example, we can apply the middleware to every route except for those with the coffees prefix if we wanted. Now that we've looked at a few of the options available to us here, Let's revert back to our original for routes wildcard since we want to bind the logging middleware to every existing endpoint for now. Let's open up the logging middleware file again and add some additional functionality in here. For a fun example, let's calculate how long the entire request response cycle takes by using console.time. Note that this calculation will include the interceptors, filters, guards, method handlers, etc. that this route may have as well. In this example, we're hooking into the Express.js response finish event so we know when our console time end should occur. Let's save our changes and navigate to Insomnia. Now let's execute a random HTTP request to our application and head back to the terminal. As we can see, there's a new request response message indicating that the full round trip took roughly 23 milliseconds. This was all a basic example, but hopefully this shows you the potential that middleware brings to an application. For a more realistic use case, you could potentially utilize something like what we just created to log long-lasting methods to a database and keep track of how long every API takes to complete.